Hello again. I'm Dan Sulmasy, the Andre Helliger's Professor of Biomedical Ethics in the Departments of Medicine and Philosophy and Director of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown. And I'm talking to you today about dignity and bioethics. Dignity, as you are probably aware, is a widely cited word in bioethical debates, particularly in Europe, where it's actually invoked as a principle, maybe less so here in the United States, but it's also been very harshly criticized, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom. People like Ruth Macklin consider the use of dignity as a moral concept to be vacuous, and Steven Pinker has even called it stupid. And there is a sense in which it is used as a slogan, which can make it sometimes more difficult to understand. Oregon, for instance, has a law that legalizes assisted suicide, which you may know is called the Death with Dignity Act. So it seems to mean that dignity is compatible with assisted suicide. And yet, many of the people who oppose it say that assisted suicide is an offense against dignity. So if that's the case, it can't possibly be true that the word dignity is being used the same way by both camps. So it does pay for us to think a little bit more clearly about the word dignity and how it's used in bioethics, and that's what I'd like to do with you today. As I said, Ruth Macklin has called it a useless concept, but her argument is really question-begging. Basically, her premise is that dignity doesn't mean anything more than autonomy. So she concludes that dignity isn't anything more than autonomy, and that dignity adds nothing to autonomy. Well, that means she's just asserting that dignity is autonomy three different ways, and what's arbitrarily asserted can be arbitrarily denied. I want to take a deeper dive into the word, looking at the philology of the word dignity, its history as a moral concept. I want to suggest to you there are three basic senses of the word. I'm going to take you into the field of axiology, the theory of value, talk about the logical and linguistic relationships between the different senses of the word, and then bring us back to bioethics to show you how the word actually can be helpful in unpacking bioethical conundrums and in debating bioethics. Now, it may surprise some of you that there is nothing like our contemporary notion of dignity in the Hebrew Scriptures or the New Testament. There's almost no mention of it in Plato or Aristotle. The word begins to have a moral valence in the Stoics, particularly the Roman Stoics, Seneca and Cicero, where dignity means worth. The worth of a person is reflected in the ability of others to recognize in that person a true instance of human excellence, someone who has dignity in that sense. Hobbes makes use of the word. In the Leviathan, he says, the value or worth of a man, as of other things, his price, that is to say, so much as would be given for the use of his power. And therefore it is not absolute, but a thing dependent on the need and judgment of another. The public worth of a man, which is the value set on him by the Commonwealth, is that which men commonly call dignity. A very different use from the Stoics, but different still from the use of the word in Kant. I think Immanuel Kant was horrified by the way the word was used by Hobbes, and seems to me to be directly responding to it. Kant says, the respect I bear others, or which another can claim from me, is the acknowledgement of the dignity of another man. That is, a worth which has no price, no equivalent for which the object of valuation could be exchanged. Now that sounds a lot more close to our contemporary understanding of the word dignity. What I want to suggest to you, and there are plenty of other examples through history, but I gave you three, is that these three are really signifying three senses of the word dignity. One I'm going to call attributed, another inflorescent, and another intrinsic. Attributed, inflorescent, and intrinsic dignity. They're related, but they are different. Attributed dignity is the value that comes by attribution, the act of conferring worth or value on another, particularly another person. It is conventional. It differs from place to place, time to time. When somebody says, this work is beneath my dignity, they're talking about it in this attributed sense, attributed by another, or even the value we could attribute to ourselves. And that's roughly the Hobbesian sense. That's distinct from what I call inflorescent dignity. By that I mean a process or state of affairs of something that has an intrinsic dignity that is expressive of that intrinsic value. And when you're talking about a human being and say something like, she bore up under adversity with great dignity, you're talking about someone who is flourishing as a human being, inflorescent as a human being, and expressing the excellence of being a human, and that's what gives them dignity, and that's the Stoic sense of the word. And lastly, there is this intrinsic sense, which I will say is the value a human being has by virtue of being human and nothing else. When we say something like slavery is an offense against human dignity, we're using it in this intrinsic sense. And that's roughly, I would say, the Kantian sense of dignity. Now, the implications are these, that all three senses seem to have a moral valence, but we have to be careful about what sense of dignity we're invoking at what point in what argument. And I think it further suggests that we need to establish a foundation for the moral use of the word. Simply because they've been used these different ways doesn't mean that it's justified to use them in those ways. And so I want to do so by what I'll call an axiological argument, to say that there are, in essence, three different kinds of values in the world. There are intrinsic values, attributed values, and inflorescent values. Intrinsic values are values that we discover. We don't create them. They depend on our recognizing a thing as the kind of thing that it is. We come upon a redwood tree, we come upon a diamond, we come upon a eagle soaring. We want to say that these things have an intrinsic value, a value that we discover, we don't create. Attributed values require a valuer, and they are relative to that valuer. So when I say that being dependent upon others is beneath my dignity, we're using the word dignity, we're attributing value to ourselves in this sense of attribution. Or if we think about money. Money has nothing but attributed value. It's otherwise pieces of paper that we exchange, or now signals that we're exchanging on our cell phones that don't have any intrinsic value, but we attribute value to them. And then inflorescent values are those that depend upon our knowledge of the kind of thing it is that's manifesting the value, something that shows itself as an excellent specimen of what it is. And we're talking about virtue, we're talking about human beings showing excellence as human beings in an inflorescent way. So I take my clues on intrinsic value, and this goes back to some of what I've spoken about to you earlier, if you're listening to the series, the interrelationship between environmental ethics and bioethics. Reading environmental ethicist Holmes Ralston III got me thinking about intrinsic value. The value a thing has by virtue of its being the kind of thing that it is. That there are natural kinds of things in the world that have value, that if we are really morally aware beings, we need to recognize that there are natural kinds of things that have these values. Redwood trees, eagles, forests. They're not valuable simply for what we can do to them or with them for ourselves. Their value is not relative to our interests as valuers, but they have value in themselves, an intrinsic value. And my argument is that since intrinsic value means the value something has by virtue of its being the kind of things that it is, that they are, that if there are such things as intrinsic values, such values will depend upon our ability first to discern what kind of thing it is. And so I think that dignity is simply the name we give, at least in an intrinsic sense of the word, to the intrinsic value of human beings. The value that we have by virtue of being the kinds of things that we are, human beings. Intrinsic dignity is the intrinsic value of any natural kind that has kind-typical capacities, I will say, for language, rationality, love, free will, moral agency, creativity, aesthetic sensibility, and the ability to grasp the finite and the infinite. Those are human attributes, things that are typical of us as a natural kind. And that's what gives us the intrinsic value we have, which is intrinsic dignity. And if that's the case, then intrinsic value, the value we have by virtue of being the kinds of things that we are, is the foundation of human rights. We don't have rights because we've attributed them to people. We have rights because we recognize that those who have this intrinsic worth called dignity have rights. It's profound, but not infinite. It's radically equal and inalienable. It can't be given away, sold away, or taken from us. It is not speciesist. Any natural kind that you could come across that has these kind typical capacities would have intrinsic dignity. If E.T. belongs to a kind that has language, rationality, love, free will, moral agency, creativity, aesthetic sensibility, and grasping the finite and the infinite, and the movie would suggest E.T. did, then E.T. has intrinsic dignity. Moreover, it doesn't depend upon the ability of an individual to express all these kind typical capacities, but on being a member of the kind. And this is foundational to medicine because, let's say, we think that rationality is a kind typical capacity that gives human beings their intrinsic worth, then someone who's unconscious is obviously not capable, at least at that moment, of rationality. This doesn't mean they've lost their dignity. In fact, medicine and nursing reach out to help precisely because the comatose are members of a kind that has this intrinsic worth called dignity, human beings. And the gap between their kind specific capacities and their present state even helps to define what their illness is, being unconscious. Let me put it more simply. Martin Luther King said he learned about dignity from his grandmother, and I think he was talking about it in this intrinsic sense. His grandmother, he said, told him, "Martin, don't let anybody ever tell you that you're not a somebody. That being somebody is what dignity means. The concept is that everybody is a somebody. Somebodyness is our intrinsic dignity." Now, attributed dignities, by contrast, are the values we attribute to others based on attributes such as their merit, prestige, power, popularity, appearance, their freedom, their independence. It may be the value we attribute to ourselves to the extent that we have these. These vary from time to time, place to place, person to person. Now, it's important to note that illness and death relentlessly assault attributed dignity, right? And this is important to know when we're thinking about dignity in bioethics. The sick, the disabled, and the dying do have, sadly, less prestige in our world. They do, by virtue of their sickness, have less physical capability. They have less political power in most instances. The sick are often shunned by others. They may have an altered appearance. They may have limitations on their freedom, and they are often dependent upon others. And these are assaults on the attributed dignity of other human beings, rightly or wrongly. The pressure is there. But I want to suggest that they haven't thereby lost their intrinsic dignity. They still have an intrinsic value simply because they're human. They have this interest-independent value. Inflorescent dignity also is featured in illness. These are virtues that even people who are terribly sick, and we know them, people who are dying, and we've known them, particularly those of us who have the privilege of caring for them, can flourish precisely as mortal kinds of beings confronting limitation and death through their patience, their courage, their generosity, their creativity, and their hope, even in the midst of illness, and they can be teachers for the rest of us. So we know people who flourish even as they are sick, even as they are dying, displaying excellence as human beings, knowing that they are, like the rest of us, mortal. Lastly, I had promised you in the theoretical part some of the logical and linguistic relationship between these three senses of dignity. It's probably become clear, but I want to make it abundantly clear right now that intrinsic dignity is the foundational concept. We would not speak of attributed or inflorescent value as dignity if we didn't already assume that dignity was the intrinsic value of the individual as a member of a kind that has the value that we say is dignity. So, for instance, a rosemary bush does have intrinsic value, but that value is not dignity. And because the intrinsic value of a rosemary bush is not dignity, great as it is, and I'm a gardener and I love rosemary, we don't say that if it gets powdery mildew, that's beneath its dignity. That is, we're not saying it has attributed dignity because it doesn't have any intrinsic dignity. Nor do we say that if my rosemary bush in the garden has blue flowers, this manifests its dignity. No, we say that it manifests its value. It's flourishing as the kind of thing that it is, but it doesn't have an inflorescent dignity because it doesn't have any intrinsic dignity. It has intrinsic value, but not the value that belongs to a kind like the human that is capable of so many of the things that we are as the kind of things that we are. This then leads to some moral norms regarding dignity. The first I would suggest is that we respect all members of natural kinds that have intrinsic dignity, whether that's human beings or, if we encounter them closely, ET, that we respect the capacities that confer intrinsic dignity on natural kinds that have that intrinsic value, that there is an imperfect duty to act consistently with intrinsic dignity, to conduct ourselves in a way that's consistent with our intrinsic dignity, an imperfect duty to build up the attributed dignity of our fellow human beings who have lost part of that or have had it assaulted by the conditions in which they live, to respect the intrinsic value of other kinds, like rosemary bushes or redwood trees or eagles, and never to undermine the intrinsic dignity of the human being. So I promised we'd take this back to sort of see how this theory would work and to show that it's not useless, as Macklin says, in thinking about bioethics. Let's just look at understanding our language when we're talking about care of the dying. If someone says being incontinent is so undignified, they're talking about their attributed dignity. What we need to do is try to find ways to build up their attributed dignity under those circumstances. If someone says they're of another person who's sick or dying, his patience with the aides who care for him is so dignified. They're talking about that person's inflorescent dignity, what they are manifesting in terms of their ability as human beings to express virtue even in the midst of their limitation and death. And if someone says to another person who is dying, we continue to cherish you even as the bonds that keep us together are slowly dissolving. What I think they're talking about there in cherishing and respect is the intrinsic value of that person. And how does it relate to action? Well, with respect to attributed dignity, I think that is the goal of palliative care. It's to build up to the extent possible the attributed dignity of the dying in the face of the relentless assault that illness and dying place upon someone who is dying. With respect to inflorescent dignity, I think we need to do a better job, just like we need to do a better job of palliative care. We need to do a better job giving the dying the space and the opportunity to continue to grow, even as they're dying. Not say it's over, get away from us, but be open to learning what they can teach us. And in terms of intrinsic dignity, I think that respect for the foundational value of intrinsic dignity, which makes us even reach out to build up the attributed dignity or give the space for inflorescent dignity to flourish, means that we would not act in such a way that we would undermine the intrinsic dignity of the human being through euthanasia or assisted suicide. Maybe one other way to make this clear, perhaps the clearest it can be, is through poetry. Donald Hall is a poet whose wife, Jane Kenyon, died of a leukemia, and he wrote about her this way as she was facing her last days. And that's the name of the poem, Last Days. Incontinent, 3 nights before she died, Jane needed lifting onto the commode. He wiped her and helped her back into bed. At 5, he fed the dog and returned to find her across the room sitting in a straight chair. When she couldn't stand, how could she walk? He feared she would fall and called for an ambulance to the hospital, but when he told Jane, her mouth twisted down and tears started. Do we have to? He canceled. Jane said, Perkins, be with me when I die. I think this is a poem about dignity. It is about the intrinsic dignity of the human. It is about the assaults on the attributed dignity of a person that illness, injury, and dying can bring upon us. It is about the inflorescent dignity of a human being shining through in the face of great adversity, helping us to understand the way in which the word is used, helping us to understand the relationship between those 3 senses of the word, I think will help us to be much better in our care for the dying. But I think it'll be help to us, and I could go on to ways in which it could help us in understanding other bioethical questions and debates where we use the word dignity in either the intrinsic, the attributed, or the inflorescent sense. So I hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the conference.